With the Ukraine crisis in full effect, the importance of NATO for Europe and the West cannot be ignored. However, what will happen with NATO if Donald Trump returns to the White House? Trump's attacks on NATO began long before he took office in his previous term and have only become worse. Then candidate Trump's claims that the United States bears an unfair share of NATO's costs as compared to Europe are not new. European cities were perplexed by his claim that NATO was obsolete because it was not doing enough to combat terrorism, especially in light of the organization's 15-year commitment to Afghanistan. Even more worrisome was his apparent willingness to condition the holiest of holies, the US promise under Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty, to come to the support of any ally that comes under assault. Trump has hinted that this would be conditional on whether or not the ally in issue had fulfilled its financial responsibilities to us, in this case by allocating 2% of GDP to the military as required by NATO. At the much-anticipated NATO leaders meeting in Brussels on May 25th, the president reiterated this position, although he did so without mentioning Article 5 once. Instead, he focused mostly on European defense funding. Trump even went as far as to say that he wanted to withdraw the US from NATO. Those fears were originally stirred last year when the US leader warned that he could exit the 29-member defense group without congressional permission. At the time, Trump was urging member countries to raise spending. Since then, though, the Republican has backtracked on that threat. There is little doubt in the minds of world leaders that Trump dislikes being a part of multilateral organizations. Soon after taking office, the president pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement and a large Pacific Trade Treaty. It is accepted wisdom that free countries find it more difficult to uphold long-term promises, but Trump is without peer as a wild card. In addition, Trump's re-election isn't an improbable possibility. The Republican nomination is widely believed to be his for the taking. While in office, Trump was extremely critical of his allies and laudatory of tyrants like North Korea's Kim Jong-un. "I'm backed by NATO, the United Kingdom, and Vladimir Putin. Who would have thought Putin would be the easiest of them all?" he exclaimed. Infamously, Trump chose to believe in Putin when over FBI in Helsinki, further undermining US intelligence. Everything could have been far worse. John Bolton, the former national security advisor, claims in his memoir that he had to convince Trump not to withdraw from NATO in 2018. In a recent interview, Bolton speculated that Trump might have left NATO before the end of a second Trump administration. How the current situation in Ukraine would have been with Trump in the White House is indeed a scary thought. America may re-elect a leader of the free world in less than 2 years who is opposed to maintaining the post-World War II rules-based international system and the institutions and alliances that have upheld it for the past 7 decades. That would render pointless a lot of the current effort and sacrifice being made, both by Ukraine and to a much lesser extent, the West. Currently, Biden seems to be favoring Europe, especially from his response to the Ukraine-Russia crisis. Even before the war broke out, Biden had already received widespread acclaim in Europe for his un-Trumpy policies, such as the United States' return to the Paris Climate Accord and the elimination of tariffs on European steel and aluminum exports, as well as his generally warmer tone when discussing alliances and partnerships. Due in large part to the Biden administration's strong relationship in the face of the Russia invasion, many believe the United States is once again playing its traditional role as a security supplier in Europe. Underneath this placid exterior, however, is the looming threat of US internal policies, which is having an increasingly negative effect on US foreign policy. Concerned Europeans are already looking ahead to the 2024 election and the prospect of Trump's comeback. The transatlantic issue would not have been solved even if Trump suddenly chose not to run for office. With the current state of American politics, Europeans can no longer take it for granted that the Biden counter-revolution will persist. The popularity of the "Make America Great Again" foreign policy within the Republican Party is one example of this movement. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley has coined the term nationalist foreign policy to describe the movement inside the Republican Party that is a popular reaction against the policies of free trade, immigration, and military operations abroad advocated by the party's elites. The MAGA narrative states that the United States' traditional European allies take advantage of the country through unfair trade agreements and free riding on the security guarantees provided by the United States. If this account is correct, the Allies are responsible for the breakdown of the European security order and their inability to dissuade Russia in Ukraine. 11 Trump supporters in the Senate opposed the $40 billion in military aid to Ukraine because of this concern. I'll be damned if I'm going to prioritize Ukraine's eastern border right now while our own southern border is overwhelmed by a human tsunami of illegal immigration, Republican Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance stated. While Vance and his ilk portray Russia as less crooked than Ukraine and as legitimate in its fear of NATO's eastward enlargement, they nonetheless argue that Russia is not America's primary worry. The majority of Republican senators supported the $40 billion package despite the MAGA warnings. A small group of conservative Republicans led by Senator Mitt Romney argue forcefully for an internationalist stance. The remaining group, which could be labeled MAGA Light, shares many of the foreign policy beliefs of traditional conservatives but toes the MAGA line for electoral gain. Despite their calls for the death of Russian President Vladimir Putin, they have adopted Trump's insistence that Europeans handle their own defense. To make matters worse, the Republican view of the European Union places it on the wrong side of America's culture camp because of its strong support for identity politics. Republican elites are increasingly pitting their party against what they call the wokeness agenda and weakness agenda, respectively. Public opinion polls reveal that identity politics and PC norms have emerged as major fault lines in the United States. The Republican Party as a whole has been trying to profit from this division by painting Democrats as identity politics focused and weak on the international stage. The rising tide of support for an America First policy exposes NATO once again to grave danger. If he runs for president again in 2024, it's likely that Trump will be the Republican Party's nominee. Trump's grip on the GOP is not entirely secure, as evidenced by recent primaries and the actions of sitting Republicans in the House and Senate, but he is still the party's most prominent figure. If Trump is re-elected, he will have a Republican House and Senate that is far less likely to resist his foreign policy than it was during his first term in office. And he will also be a president who is more likely to listen to the voices from those closest to him who encourage his baser inclinations. What this means on the global stage is that the other members of NATO need to start preparing for both America Light, where the US remains participating but plays a much smaller role, and America Free, where the US effectively departs NATO scenarios. An official withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty is unlikely to be approved by the Senate, but the president has broad commander-in-chief authorities and said, "We are not going to station forces here, we are not training with you, and we will never fight for you," could be enough to effectively unravel the American presence in the alliance. Regardless of who occupies the White House in the future, NATO must be able to hold its own for the sake of risk management. So, that is all the time we have for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the video. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and do hit the bell icon to remain updated about all our future videos. See you all next time.